My presentation tonight is called Acting as If, Liberia's National Action Plan for the Implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Just briefly, this presentation came about kind of in a backwards way. What I had initially wanted to look at was the promotion of women's leadership in Liberia. And the easiest way for me to do that was looking at the National Action Plan for Security Council Resolution, which I'll go into in a moment. But what I found was that the available data wasn't there, that the benchmarking that they had promised had never been published, at least outside of the UN system, and I could not find the data, so I had to backtrack, which ended me up with a question of what must the government of Liberia do to ensure the success of its National Action Plan for UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. A brief history of Liberia, for those who don't know. It is actually a fascinating country, one that has a legacy very dissimilar from a lot of African countries, in that it was founded by returning slaves and Quakers who brought slaves to be repatriated back in Africa, and it set up this whole system of the repatriated Africans becoming an elite class and holding down what are considered to be the indigenous there. And that system perpetuated itself from the early 1800s up through the 1970s and 1980s, when there was a series of conflicts which ended in a 14-year civil war headed by Charles Taylor, who many of you may have heard was just convicted in the ICC for war crimes in Sierra Leone. But the Civil War was absolutely endemic. It touched every single person within the society in a series of brutal and really horrific ways, including rampant sexual and gender-based violence against women, committed by not only the Liberian military, but also by rebels as well. That ended with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. It is the 14th attempt at a peace agreement associated with this civil war, and it brought peace to the country, and eventually also brought Africa's first female head of state in Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who has a very interesting legacy of her own, although I don't have time to get into it tonight. But what she inherited was a country where virtually all of the infrastructure had been destroyed, where she had roughly 2 generations of people who knew nothing but war, where child soldiers had been employed and not only used for their ability to commit crimes during the war, but that were also often the victims of trauma and substance abuse in the form of drugs and alcohol. And essentially, what she inherited was just a mess in terms of the donor community. They were looking to recoup debts that Liberia owed, and that is in a little bit of struggle with the attempts to rebuild society. So around the same time that the peace agreement was signed, in 2000, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed. And it was passed in response to war crimes that had been committed, and by the changing international norms of intervention and the responsibility to protect after the genocide in Rwanda and the Bosnian War. It was a reshaping of the idea of what traditional security is, and the idea that that what needs to be done may not always be conceived in a traditional military sense, that there is a responsibility to respond to complex humanitarian crises. And so Security Council Resolution, what it says is that women have a place in determining peace, in promoting peace, and in sustaining peace after conflicts are resolved. There were a number of subsequent follow-up resolutions that deal with things like sexual and gender-based violence committed against women, about rape and the responsibility of peacekeeping troops and others, but I don't have time to go into them today. Liberia itself is a special case, not only for the fact that it has Africa's first female head of state, but also because it has a number of female firsts, which make oftentimes Liberia to be considered a top-down success, in that it has had the only female special representative to the Secretary General, the first deployment of an all-female police force. It was a group of Indian women who came and trained Liberian female police cadets. And also, some of you may also know that along with President Alan Johnson Sirleaf, Leigh McGoey, who was instrumental in ending the Civil War in 2003, also received the Nobel Peace Prize this past year. So in terms of women in high levels achieving great things, there has been some success, but the National Action Plan for Liberia deals much more with the day-to-day work of women there. And so the national framework for action really deals with the human security model of working to address both the direct and indirect violence experienced by women and girls, but really all of Liberian society. Because as you can imagine, in a post-conflict context, it is not just women and girls who need assistance. But the framework itself is based on 4 pillars. The first is protection, which has 3 strategic goals within it. To promote psychosocial trauma counseling for women and girls, protect the rights and strength and security of the entire country, and increase access to health education. Additionally, the prevention model goes directly to the prevention of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls. Participation and empowerment works to promote the participation in conflict prevention, peace building, and post-conflict recovery processes. Really, this seeks to involve women in owning the peace that they really have worked tirelessly to sustain since the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and even before. And finally, increase access to housing and natural resources. As with most post-conflict societies, there is some question about who owns what at the end of wars, and also what rights women have to traditional or family lands. And finally, promotion, which really seeks to make women involved in the implementation of the Liberian National Action Plan and education and training for conflict prevention, working forward to make those things happen. So I'll briefly go through these. Like I had said, one of the main parts of production is this women police force. They are doing great things to try and recruit women to join the police force. There are scholarships available to girls in high school who would like to join the police force. They get their high school education paid for, which in a country with 80% unemployment and 50% of households headed by women, it's a huge, huge thing to get this kind of a scholarship. There are also women and children protective forces, which seek to, within the police, they deal specifically with the victims of sexual and gender-based violence. They have also amended rape laws to raise the age of consent from 16 to 18 and classify rape within marriage as a punishable offense. The other part of security sector reform that still needs to be addressed, the significant donor in military reforms is the U.S. government, and the training of the Liberian military is now in the hands of DynCorp, which some of you may know as being the corporation that perpetrated human trafficking offenses in the Bosnian conflict prior to this, and also health access and education, which I'll get to. So sexual and gender-based violence is and was endemic during the crisis and has been sustained since. In a 2004 survey, between 60 and 70% of Liberian women had been victims of sexual and gender-based violence during the conflict. Most often that's torture, rape, gang rape, any and all of the above. And that culture has persisted since. It is the most reported crime in Liberia, and the average age of those reporting crimes is under 15 years. What that means is that there are a lot of children being raped. What that also probably means is that there are a lot of women who aren't reporting rape. And in a 2003 survey, going back to the health and education piece, female patients in health clinics, all of those who reported some kind of gynecological issue also were tested for sexually transmitted infections, and every one of them had a sexually transmitted disease. So this is a huge issue that the National Action Plan seeks to address, and in doing so is really working towards the prevention model. Participation and empowerment, I'll do this briefly. like I said, 80% of the people in Liberia, according to studies, are unemployed. Of those, there are a significant number who work in an informal economy, and there are tensions between the government and this informal economy. The government is trying to standardize and make a more formal economy, but that has significant impacts on women. Women often deal with issues that men do not in terms of childcare, reliable training, education, and once this becomes a more formalized economy, there's often an influx of men because it's now seen as a more legitimate means of gaining employment. But at the same time, nearly 50% of households are headed by women, so this is a huge issue for women who need to sustain their families, who really need this money. And finally, promotion, the fourth pillar, connecting the grassroots with Monrovia. Monrovia is the capital. And there are a substantial network of women working in all aspects of implementation of the National Action Plan and also just with empowerment in general. But there seems to be a significant divide between the very top, the elite in Monrovia. Like I said, there are many elite women working at the top, and there's a divide between them and the women working on the grassroots that needs to be strengthened. Later, I believe early next year, the UN mission in Liberia is going to be pulling out, and what that means is there's going to be a huge vacuum in terms of donors and also infrastructure to deal with some of these issues, and there needs to be some serious consideration in how the Liberian government is going to deal with that vacuum. And as part of that, once the UN pulls out, the reporting mechanisms for the National Action Plan may be altered because a lot of these are joint partnerships with the UN, and the thought is that they will be sustained, but because the National Action Plan runs out in 2013, they will need to revamp that and sort of renegotiate what kinds of joint programs there will be. So my policy recommendations for going forward is that once the second phase of the National Action Plan takes place in 2013, what really needs to happen is making sure that the reporting of the quotas and the benchmarks Liberian government has set for itself needs to be met in order to test the progress specifically at the grassroots level and the rural communities. There needs to be significant attention paid to this. In terms of security sector reform, they need to continue the support of the Women and Children Protective Services and other efforts to combat sexual and gender-based violence, which includes making space and time available for all Liberians who need it to receive counseling and substance abuse treatment, because it is not just the women who are victims that need this kind of counseling and treatment, it is also the men who are perpetrating these crimes. And when it's framed as a women's issue, men get left out of the equation. And finally, to diversify the education and training opportunities available to all Liberians, which in part would be encouraging entrepreneurship, allowing the informal sector to grow in a more monitored way. One potential program that could do this is there's a Goldman Sachs program called 10,000 Women and 10,000 Small Businesses that is working in Liberia and is working with President Johnson Sirleaf to sort of build that, but to reach that down at a lower level, I think would be incredibly impactful as well. And so with all of that said, life can change. This is not a static moment in time for Liberia. They have seen incredible growth and attempts at change, and with the right donor community and with the right people in power and the right programs, this is fixable. So that's my project. Oh, questions? I was thinking I'm done. Yes?
Does the women's police force have any powers of enforcement, or powers of arrest?
Yes, they do. They are police officers, but one of the big issues, and I don't know what the situation is now, but one of the big issues that was reported was that the police officers are unarmed. So there are some issues there. There's also issues with men seeing the women police as actual police officers. So there are tensions there, but from what I've read, it's really been seen as a success, and that women and girls do feel comfortable approaching women police officers.
ask one more.
Yeah.
Are there any statistics to indicate the repercussions against these same women for going out and trying to assert some degree of authority? Has been any extended violence against them, or?
No, I mean, not that I've come across. I think the real fear is of, the real fear is that they need to earn a living. And what do? Do you try and fight for your rights and assert them in one aspect, or do you go and make your dollar a day that you can make? So that's the conflict for women, and that's what this National Action Plan is trying to address, is carving out that space so that women can get on with their lives but also be empowered to make change. Any other questions?